The body had been cold for 3 days before they pinned it on Ghorza Mudborn. Charles Bailey heard the accusation shouted across the dockyard before he even saw her heard the name bellowed by Constable Wren Aldrich from the top of the harbormaster's steps, and the word murderer strung after it like a rope already waiting for a neck. He was chest-deep in the scaffolding of a half-built cog at the time, iron mallet in hand, oakum caulk on his knuckles, and he should have kept his head down. That was what a sensible man did in Saltmere when the law was shouting and a crowd was gathering. That was what a man with a rented room and 48 coin in a tobacco tin did when the smell of a lynching was already beginning to form in the air like a coming squall. He did not keep his head down. He climbed out of the scaffolding, set his mallet on the dock plank and looked. She was at the far end of the harbor road, at the place where the fish market bled into the old rope walk, and she was enormous. That was the first thing, the sheer size of her. Ghorza Mudborn stood 6.5 feet tall in her bare feet, which she was not wearing today. Today she wore heavy travel boots laced to the knee, fitted warriors, leathers the color of dark pine bark cinched tight at the waist with a wide buckled belt, and a sleeveless laced blouse beneath it, all dark green, cut to the shoulder, tight enough across the torso that you could see every breath she took. Her arms were bare and formidable. Her skin was the gray-green of river stone after a flood. Her jaw was strong. Her lower tusks caught the gray harbor light like chips of pale ivory, and her black hair was shaved at the sides with a long braided fall down her back, threaded with 3 copper rings. She was, by any honest accounting, the most striking person Charles had ever seen in the port of Saltmere, and she had clearly been crying. Not weeping now. The tears had dried and left pale tracks through the road dust on her face, but her eyes were red at the rims, and there was a rawness about her expression that she was trying very hard to wall up behind something fiercer. She was not succeeding. A dozen dockhands and fishwives had formed a loose ring around her, not quite touching her but pressing the air close. Constable Aldrich was reading from a paper, and 2 of his deputies had their crossbows raised. In connection with the death of one Tam Briscoe, found at the base of the widow's ledge 3 mornings past, you are ordered to surrender yourself to the custody of. I did not kill Tam Briscoe, Ghorza said. Her voice was low, measured, the kind of voice that had learned to be calm because the alternative had consequences. I was not on the widow's ledge. I was loading freight at Pier 7 until past the 2nd bell of night, and there are 6 dockhands who can say so. The dockhands are orcs, and their word will not be taken before this court. The crowd made a sound that was not quite agreement but was not quite objection either. It was the coward's sound, the sound of a crowd that has already decided to let whatever happen happen. Charles picked up his mallet and walked. He was not a big man. He was 5 feet 10, lean from a decade of dock labor, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving and hands that were about as unimpressive as a working man's hands could be, scarred, calloused, ink-stained along the left thumb from the shipwright's marking pen he always stuck behind his ear. He was 26 years old, and he had no particular reputation in Saltmere, except that he was good with a hull frame, and had never once shorted a day's work. He walked through the outer ring of the crowd, and he kept walking until he was standing beside Ghorza Mudborn, close enough that his shoulder came to approximately the level of her ribs. He looked up at Constable Aldrich. "Which 6 dockhands?" he said. Aldrich stared at him. "Excuse me." She said 6 dockhands will vouch for her. I want their names before you dismiss them. If you dismiss them on account of their blood and not their testimony, that is not law, that is a gutting. So tell me their names. "Bailey," someone muttered at the edge of the crowd. "Don't." Ghorza looked down at him, not with gratitude, not yet. With a kind of wary, disbelieving assessment, the way you looked at a stray dog that had walked between you and a wolf, trying to understand what it thought it was doing. He had not looked at her yet. He was still watching Aldrich. "This is none of your business," the constable said. "I was on Pier 7 myself until past the 2nd bell 3 nights ago," Charles said. "I saw her. She was offloading a grain shipment with Yarrow's crew. I will testify to that." The silence that followed was different from the one before it. It was the kind of silence that had weight. Aldrich descended 2 steps. He was a square, gray-bearded man with the permanent squint of someone who spent too much time in sea wind, and he did not like being contradicted in public, especially in front of a crowd he had been expecting to ride along with him. "You saw her from 20 yards in the dark. I saw her from 10 feet in the lantern light. She is not, as you may have noticed, difficult to miss." Something happened at the edge of his awareness, a shift in her breathing perhaps, or the faint sound of a very short, very controlled exhale. He still did not look at her. Aldrich refolded his paper. "You are not officially part of this proceeding, Bailey." "Then unofficially I am calling your evidence thin and your method shameful," Charles said, "and I will be at the magistrate's office tomorrow morning to say so on record. Is there anyone else present who was working Pier 7 that night?" 2 hands went up in the crowd, hesitant, but up. Dunner Pell, the old rope-walk foreman, and a young woman named Sessa who sold smoked eel from a cart near the pier gate. Aldrich stared at all of them for a long moment. Then he lowered his paper another inch and said something to his deputies that Charles could not hear, and the crossbows came down. "This is not finished," Aldrich said. He was looking at Ghorza. "When the actual evidence is assembled and the magistrate rules, then I will be here," Ghorza said. "I am not running." The crowd dispersed the way crowds always did when the entertainment went sideways slowly, without meeting anyone's eyes. Aldrich and his deputies retreated up the harbormaster's steps, and Charles finally turned and looked up at Ghorza Mudborn properly. Her eyes were the amber green of shallow seawater over dark sand. She was looking at him with an expression that was still walled up behind the fierceness, but there was a crack in it now, thin as a seam in old timber. "You are going to catch hell for that," she said. "Probably," he said. "Are you all right?" She blinked. Visibly, physically blinked, like the question had arrived in a language she was not fully fluent in. Then she looked away across the harbor and the cracked-open expression sealed itself shut again behind a kind of irritated dignity. "I am fine," she said. "I do not need a human dockhand to fight my battles." "No," he agreed, "but I had a mallet and nothing better to do." She looked back at him. Whatever she had been expecting him to say, it was not that. He tucked the mallet under his arm and held out his calloused, ink-stained hand. "Charles Bailey, shipwright, I really was on Pier 7 that night." A long pause, then she took his hand. Her grip was careful, the grip of someone who knew exactly how strong she was and had learned, probably the hard way, to be precise with it around people who were not. Her hand was twice the size of his and her skin was warm. "Ghorza Mudborn," she said, "freight hauler, and I know who you are." He raised an eyebrow. "You built the keel frame on the Storm Bell 3 years ago," she said. "Everyone in the harbor knows your work." He could not entirely prevent the small heat that climbed up the back of his neck at that. He was not accustomed to being known. He cleared his throat. "Where are you staying tonight?" he said. "That," she said carefully, "is a somewhat pointed question. Because if Aldrich is not done, you should not be somewhere he can reach you without witnesses," he said. "The Anchor House on Cordage Street rents rooms, and Merritt, who runs it, does not turn away custom based on blood. I could walk you over." Another long silence. She studied him from that great height with those shallow seawater eyes. "Why?" she said. It was not quite a question. It was more of a demand that he examine himself in front of her. He thought about it honestly. "Because what just happened was unjust," he said, "and I was standing close enough to do something about it, so I did. That is the whole reason." She exhaled long, slow, through her nose. Then she looked back at the harbor and then at the road and then at him again, and some long internal calculation resolved itself. "Lead the way, shipwright," she said. He did. He did not know, walking up Cordage Street beside her in the gray afternoon light with the sea smell following them and the stares of passers-by hitting them like small thrown stones, that he had met Ghorza Mudborn before. He did not remember. It had been 5 years ago and he had been 21, and she had been an 18-year-old working a cargo sling on a different dock in a different port, and it had been one evening, one conversation over a shared bowl of dock stew, nothing more. But she remembered. She had remembered for 5 years, which she would not tell him for another week, and the knowledge of that remembering sat behind her eyes the whole walk to the anchor house like a coal behind a closed grate warm, and waiting. Merritt took them both in without comment, gave Ghorza a corner room on the ground floor because the ceilings were higher, and charged a fair rate. Charles paid for his own room on the floor above, a narrow thing with one shutter and a mattress that had seen better decades, and they went their separate ways. But they shared supper in the common room that night, because the benches were long and the place was full, and there was nowhere else to sit, and they talked for 4 hours. He learned that she had come to Saltmere 6 months ago from the inland border country, where she had spent the previous 3 years hauling freight for the garrison supply trains, dangerous, well-paying work that had gone badly when the garrison contracted with a cheaper outfit and let her go. He learned that she was 23, that she was very good at numbers, that she could read in 2 languages and was working on a 3rd, and that she hated, with a specificity and depth that he found almost impressive, the particular sound a rope makes when it is about to snap. He learned that she had known Tam Briscoe slightly. He had been a customs recorder who had worked the same pier, and that she had genuinely liked him, which was why the accusation had hit her the way it had. She had not cried because she was afraid. She had cried because Tam Briscoe was dead, and nobody in this town seemed to care about that. They only cared about who to blame for it. "Tell me about the widow's ledge," he said. She wrapped both her enormous hands around her ale cup. "It is a rock shelf above the cliffs on the north end of the harbor. The garrison uses it for a lookout in storm season. Tam Briscoe used to go there at night, apparently. I did not know that." "Who told you that?" She looked at him sidelong. "A man named Gregor Fass. He manages the customs office. He is also the one who filed the accusation with Aldrich." Charles set down his cup. "Gregor Fass," he said slowly. "Does Gregor Fass have any reason to want you gone from Saltmere? He has tried twice to buy out my freight contract with the Harbor Merchant Cooperative," Ghorza said. "Both times I refused. If I am arrested or driven out, my contract reverts to open auction." She paused. "I noticed this. Aldrich apparently did not." "Or he did and does not care," Charles said. "What was Fass's relationship with Briscoe?" Her eyes sharpened. They went a shade deeper amber like sun through sea glass. "You are asking the right questions, shipwright. I had a clear-headed mother who taught me to notice who benefits," he said. "Tam Briscoe was the customs recorder," she said. "Fass is the customs manager. If Briscoe found something irregular in the ledgers, if he found Fass was running unauthorized cargo through the manifest, he would have been the person to report it. And now Briscoe is dead at the bottom of the widow's ledge, and the accusation is pointed at me. It landed between them with the weight of something very ugly and very clear. "We need the ledgers," Charles said. "We," she said, with a note in her voice he could not entirely read. He met her eyes. "If you want." She was quiet for a long time after that. The common room noise rolled around them, dockhands arguing about tide tables, a tinker trying to sell something to a reluctant buyer in the corner, the fire settling in the grate. She looked at him the way she had on the harbor road, with that crack opening again in the wall behind her eyes, and this time she let it stay open a moment longer before she sealed it. "I want," she said finally, quietly. And then, as if the admission had cost something she was not entirely willing to spend, she looked back into her ale cup. He looked at the fire. His heart was doing something architectural, something structural, he thought, in the way a keel begins to settle into its notches when the frames are right. He knew this feeling. He had not felt it in 5 years, which was a long time, and he had not expected to feel it again in quite this specific way, on quite this specific evening. He did not say any of that. He finished his ale. They said good night. He lay awake in his narrow room for 2 hours thinking about those amber-green eyes and the copper rings in her braid and the precise, careful way she had taken his hand. The next morning he went to the magistrate's office and gave his testimony. Dunner, Pell, and Sessa came too, and the 3 of them spent an uncomfortable hour in a clerk's anteroom being recorded. The magistrate, a tired woman named Holt who smelled of camphor and had ink on both wrists, noted the testimony without comment and said she would review the evidence before issuing any warrant. It was not exoneration, but it was a wall between Ghorza and the cells, and that would have to do for now. Ghorza was waiting outside in the morning sun when Charles came out. She was leaning against the building's stone corner with her arms crossed and the braid over one shoulder, and the light was hitting the copper rings and the pale ivory of her tusks, and he nearly walked into the door frame. She noticed. Her mouth curved, not quite a smile, something more controlled than that, but amused in a way that said she had noticed and was not going to be merciful about it. "The testimony is recorded," he said, recovering. "I know, I heard through the window." "Right." He pulled his marking pen from behind his ear and turned it between his fingers, which was what he did when he was thinking. "The ledgers. The customs house will not open them voluntarily, but the harbor merchant cooperative do. You have friends there?" "One," she said, "Jarn Os. He is a factor, an honest one, which makes him unpopular. Can he get us a look at the cooperative's copy of the cargo manifests?" "Possibly." "What are you looking for?" "Fass's name on a cargo line that should not exist," Charles said, "or Briscoe's on a report that was filed and then somehow lost." She uncrossed her arms and came off the wall with a movement that was, for someone her size, startlingly fluid. "You really are asking the right questions," she said. "Come with me." They went to see Jarn Os. The factor's office was a cramped, paper-stacked room above a chandlery on Harbor Lane, and Jarn Os was a thin, nervous man with kind eyes who went slightly pale when Ghorza folded herself into his visitor's chair, which was several sizes too small for her, but recovered quickly. He listened to what they had to say. He was quiet for a while. Then he went to a locked cabinet behind his desk and pulled out a ledger the size of a paving stone. "Briscoe filed a discrepancy notice 4 weeks ago," Os said, setting the ledger on the desk and flipping to a marked page. "I cautioned it because the numbers he found were in a shipment that crossed through my manifest lane. A cargo of iron fittings listed weight 200 stone, actual weight closer to 300. The difference was not iron. The difference was a consignment of unlicensed war steel being moved without a garrison permit." "War steel," Ghorza said. "To whom?" "The inland buyers are noted here by a code," Os said. "But Fass manages the code registry, which means he can mask the buyer," Charles said. "He was running contraband. Briscoe found it, filed the notice, and Fass killed him to bury it." "If you can prove Fass was on the widow's ledge," Os said carefully, "the discrepancy notice and the ledger together are sufficient to bring this to the garrison magistrate rather than the harbor court. The garrison magistrate cannot be pressured by Fass's money. She answers to the fort commander directly." "Can we get the discrepancy notice?" Charles said. "I have a copy," Os said. "Briscoe gave me one before he filed. He was—" Os stopped, pressed his lips together. He was careful. He knew he was taking a risk. He had been careful and he was dead anyway, and all three of them sat with that for a moment. "Give us the copy," Ghorza said. Her voice was very quiet. "We will get Fass." Outside on Harbor Lane, in the wind off the sea, they stood shoulder to shoulder, or rather shoulder to ribcage, and looked at the document Os had given them. It was in Briscoe's own hand, neat and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who had believed in precision. Something about it made Charles's chest ache. "He was your friend," he said. Ghorza folded the paper with 2 careful fingers. "He used to bring me salt crackers," she said. "From the bakery on Cutter Street. He knew I liked them." She stopped, her jaw tightened. "He was 22 years old, and he was the only person in the customs house who spoke to me without being afraid of me first." Charles said nothing for a moment. Then, "I am not afraid of you." She looked down at him, that crack in the wall again. "No," she said, "you are not. That is still confusing. I can be confusing if it helps." Her breath came out in a short huff, not quite a laugh but close enough that it counted. "It does not help," she said. "Stop making me." She stopped again. "Stop making you what?" "Nothing," she said, and walked. He followed, smiling at the back of her braid, and wisely said nothing more. They spent 3 days building the case. It was painstaking, unglamorous work cross-referencing manifests, tracking Fass's movements on the night Briscoe died through a careful round of conversations with dock workers who had reason to be on the north end of the harbor, finding the one man, a night watchman named Holt who had no relation to the magistrate, who had seen Fass walking the cliff road at the first bell of night 3 evenings ago. Getting Holt to say so on record required an afternoon of patient argument from Charles, and the quiet, immovable presence of Ghorza sitting beside him, radiating the kind of calm certainty that makes people feel that cooperation is simply the sensible choice. In the evenings they met at the Anchor House. They ate together. They talked about the work at first, then about other things, gradually wider things, the way you begin to eat the edges of a map and find the territory expanding. He told her about his father, who had been a shipwright before him, and had died of a fever when Charles was 15, leaving him the tools and the trade and a particular way of looking at wood grain. She told him about her clan, which was 2 weeks' hard travel north into the border country, and how she had left it not because she was exiled or unwanted, but because she had needed at 18 to know if she could make herself in a world that was not already shaped around her. "And have you," he said, "made yourself?" She thought about it with the same careful seriousness she brought to manifest ledgers. "I have made a version," she said. "I am not certain it is finished." "Versions are how you get to the final form," he said. She looked at him. The amber in her eyes caught the candle on the table between them. "You have a habit," she said, "of saying things that are simple and entirely correct. It is aggravating. I will work on being wrong more often." "Do not," she said softly, and looked down at her hands on the table. On the 4th night, when the case was nearly assembled and the appointment with the garrison magistrate was set for the following morning, he found her on the dock at the end of Pier 3. She was sitting, or rather perched. Given the scale mismatch between her and the dock bollard, she was leaning against with her boots off and her feet dangling over the dark water, and there were fresh tear tracks on her face again. She did not hear him approach over the slap of the water and the cry of the night birds. He sat down beside her on the dock planks, right beside her, close enough that his shoulder touched her arm, which was approximately where his shoulder reached. The dock creaked under the shift in weight. She looked down at him with an expression of pure, unguarded shock, and that was the moment, he would think later, that was the moment her wall came all the way down. Not cracked, not ajar. Down. She had not expected it. That was the thing that struck him most, in that moment and afterward. She had genuinely not expected anyone to simply sit down beside her. She was enormous, and she was crying, and she had clearly expected him to either pretend he had not noticed or keep a careful distance. That was what people did. That was what people always did. "Tam Briscoe," he said, not a question. "He was the first," she said. Her voice was rough and low. "The first person in this harbor who just spoke to me, who did not look past me or through me or with that particular face they make." She did not have to explain what face. "I have been doing this long enough that I had stopped expecting it. And then he just walked up to my cargo sling one morning and said the knot I was using was inefficient and showed me a better one. And then we talked about knots for an hour, and then the next morning he brought the salt crackers. And someone threw him off a cliff to save their shipment," Charles said, "and pinned it on me. Yes," she exhaled, long and ragged. "It is not I am not weeping because I am frightened. I want to be clear about that." "I know," he said. "You are weeping because he was good and he is gone, and the world keeps doing that, taking the good ones and leaving the ledger running." She looked at him for a long time. The harbor water moved beneath them. The lights of the town reflected in its yellow and orange, shifting and doubling. "Charles Bailey," she said, very quietly. "Ghorza Mudborn," he said, equally quiet. "I need to tell you something." "All right." "I remember you," she said, "from before, 5 years ago in the port of Heronmere. We sat together at the dock kitchen and ate stew and talked for, I do not know how long. You do not remember me." He opened his mouth to say he did not, and then something moved at the back of his memory. A harbor evening, gray and cold, autumn already feeling like winter, and a girl. A young woman, enormously tall, sitting at the end of the dock kitchen bench with her own bowl, alone, and him sitting down because the bench was full everywhere else. And 2 hours of conversation about tides and not friction, and whether or not the old trading routes were worth reviving. The Heronmere autumn market, he said slowly. You were working a cargo sling for a merchant villain, I think the name was. Something happened in her face, something large and quiet and almost painfully held still. You do remember. I remember thinking, he said, that I had never talked to anyone that easily and wondering why I did not seek you out the next day. You were gone the next day, she said. Your ship had sailed at first light. Yes, he said, I know. He looked down at the harbor water. I have thought about that conversation a handful of times over the years. It was not a grand thing, not a dramatic remembering. Just every so often something would remind me of it. Some particularly good argument about not friction. She made a sound that was definitely a laugh this time, brief and surprised and warm. Then it faded and she was quiet. I thought about it rather more than a handful of times, she said. She did not look at him when she said it. I moved around a great deal after Heronmere. Garrison work, freight routes, harbor towns. I did not look for you. I want to be honest about that. I did not look. But she stopped. I kept the memory in better condition than was perhaps rational. He turned and looked up at her profile. The line of her jaw, the copper rings, the white arc of her tusk in the harbor light. When I came down that harbor road on the day Aldrich had his crossbows out, he said, and I saw you, I did not consciously remember, but something in me recognized something. I thought it was just, you are not a person one forgets once they have actually looked at you. She turned her head and looked down at him. They were very close. The dock was narrow and she was large and he had not moved and she had not moved. You sat down beside me, she said, and it was about more than tonight. I tend to sit down beside things that matter, he said. It is a flaw. She reached out with one enormous, careful hand and pressed her palm against the side of his jaw, gentle, the way she had been gentle with his hand on the harbor road, precise and controlled and warm. He held still and let her. Her thumb moved once against his cheekbone. Charles, she said. Yes, he said. It was not an answer to a question. It was just yes, to whatever she was about to say, to whatever it was she needed. She bent down and she kissed him. Not tentative, that was not her nature, not tentative in anything, but careful, in the way a strong person is careful with something they do not want to break. Her mouth was warm and tasted of the tea she had been drinking, and the harbor wind came through and moved her braid against his neck, and the dock creaked under them, and he brought his hand up and held her wrist where her palm was on his face and kissed her back. When they separated, she was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her before, not because it was foreign, but because it was nakedly, completely unguarded, all the walls down, all the walls gone. Tomorrow, he said, his voice a little unsteady, we go to the garrison magistrate and we put Fass in front of the law. Tomorrow, she agreed. Tonight we sit here. She settled back against the bollard. He did not move away from her, and she did not move away from him, and her arm was against his shoulder, and the harbor moved beneath them, and they sat there until the town bells rang midnight. The garrison magistrate was a compact, sharp-eyed woman named Commander's Justice Pierre Ashad, and she had the manner of someone who had personally prosecuted 3 bad men and had not yet finished with the world. She received them at the garrison hall at dawn. Ghorza and Charles, Jarn Os with his ledger, the night watchman Holt with his testimony, and Dunner Pell as a character witness for the original alibi, and she listened to the entire presentation without interrupting once. Then she read Briscoe's discrepancy notice twice. Then she looked at Gregor Fass's name on the manifest code registry copy that Os had provided, and her expression went very still and very cold. How long have you had this? She said to Os. 4 weeks, Os said. Since Briscoe filed it, I was waiting for the right time. I am not proud of that. You are correct not to be, Pierre Ashad said. She folded the papers and stood. Constable Aldrich's warrant against Ghorza Mudborn is suspended pending review, effective this conversation. I will have Gregor Fass in a garrison cell before this afternoon." She was as good as her word. They heard it through the town that same day. Fass arrested at the customs house at mid-morning, his ledger seized, 2 of his associates brought in for questioning. By afternoon, the harbor was buzzing with it, and by evening the whisper had changed shape. The orc woman had not done it. The orc woman had helped find who had. It was not a clean absolution. Nothing in Saltmere ever was clean, quickly. There were looks on the street that were still not friendly. There were people who had said ugly things in the crowd that first day who had not come forward to apologize. But the warrant was suspended, Ghorza's freight contract was untouched, and Gregor Fass was behind garrison bars. They celebrated at the Anchor House with Marit's best ale, which was not particularly good ale but came in generous cups. Os drank 1 cup and went home, which was the right move for a nervous man on an exciting day. Dunner Pell stayed for 2 cups and was cheerful about them. The night watchman Holt stayed for 3 and told 2 long stories about dogs he had owned, which were not relevant to anything but were pleasant. And then it was just the 2 of them again, in the corner booth, with the fire burning lower and the cups between them nearly empty and the day's work done. "You should be careful," Ghorza said. She was looking at the fire. "Fass has friends. The garrison has him, but his friends are still loose, and you stood up publicly and called his case against me thin. That was noticed." "No," Charles said, "I am not." She paused. "I am not trying to warn you away. I am telling you to be watchful." "I know," he said again. "Are you watching yourself?" "I always watch myself," she said with a precision that told him how true it was, how long it had been true, how much of her daily energy went to exactly that. He felt a kind of ache at it. "You do not have to watch yourself alone," he said. She turned from the fire and looked at him. "Charles, I know it has been 1 week," he said. "I know that is not enough time to make any kind of claim or offer anything worth receiving. I know that is—" "Charles," she said again, more quietly. He stopped. "I have been watching myself alone for 5 years," she said. "I know what alone feels like. I know its exact weight and texture and the way it sits in a room with you. And I know when something feels unlike that." She paused. "You feel unlike that." He reached across the table and put his hand over one of hers where it rested on the wood. She turned her hand over and closed her fingers around his. "Stay in Saltmere," he said. "I was planning to," she said. "My contract is here." "I mean," he stopped, started again. "I mean with me, near me. I am renting a room on the floor above you for no practical reason when," she said. There was a thread of something warm in it, careful but warm. "When I would rather be next to you than a floor above you," he said. "That is all." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that he thought he had said too much, moved too fast, read the dockside evening wrong. And then she said, "I snore." "What?" "I have been told I snore," she said, loudly, in the manner of a landslide. He stared at her. Then he laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. And she smiled, and it was the first time he had seen her smile fully, not just the controlled curve at the corner but all the way, with the tusks and the warmth and the amber light in her eyes. And it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in 26 years of looking at a world that contained, among other things, first light over harbor water and the grain of old hardwood and well-made sails against a clean sky. "I will live with it," he said. She turned his hand over in hers and looked at it. The calluses and the ink and the scar across the knuckle from a mallet slip 2 years ago, with an attention that felt like a kind of reading. "You are certain," she said, not doubting him, making sure. "I am certain," he said. "I have been certain since I sat down beside you on the dock last night, possibly since before that." She closed her hand around his. "Then I will move my things upstairs," she said. "The ceiling on the ground floor is lower than they promised." Which was not exactly what he had meant, and was also exactly what he had meant, and they both understood this, and neither of them said anything more about it because there was nothing left to say that the closed hands did not already cover. The weeks that followed were, by the measure of Saltmere's general opinion, scandalous. By Charles's measure, they were the best weeks of his working life. He went to the dockyard in the mornings with a cog frame to finish and came back in the evenings to someone who asked him how it had gone and meant it, who could, in fact, hold a genuine conversation about hull geometry and timber stress, and the particular virtues of lap joint construction versus edge-to-edge. Because she had been shifting cargo for 5 years and understood the bones of a ship the way a good drover understood horses. She brought her freight work into the room in the evening's manifest ledgers, weight calculations, route planning, and they worked side by side at the table with their respective papers and the candle between them, and it was domestic and ordinary and more sustaining than anything Charles had felt since before his father died. She was also, when she chose to be, wildly funny. Not in a performative way, not jokes for an audience, but in the dry, angular way of someone who had been observing the absurdity of the world for years from a height that gave her an excellent view. She described the Harbor Merchant Cooperative's quarterly meetings with a precision that made Charles put down whatever he was holding to laugh. She did voices, which she found undignified to admit, and he found extraordinary. She had a particular impersonation of Constable Aldrich that was so accurate it made Merritt from downstairs come up to the door to find out what the noise was. She was also, in the hours between lamplight and sleep, something else entirely. She was careful and she was present and she was. There was no other word for it, tender, in the way that only genuinely strong people can be tender, because there is no anxiety in it. She knew exactly what she was and what she could do, and so she could choose precisely how to touch the world and the people in it. She chose to touch him as if he mattered in the specific molecular sense, as if the fact of him, the particular fact of him, was worth paying attention to. He had not known until her that he had been waiting to feel that. He built her a box from the off-cut hardwood scraps at the dockyard, a small thing, well-jointed, with a fitted lid, for her copper rings when she took them out of her braid at night. He did not make a ceremony of giving it to her. He just set it on the table one evening. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she picked it up and turned it in her hands and examined the joints and said, "This is perfectly made." And then she looked at him and said, "You made this for me?" And he said, "Yes." And she set it down very carefully and crossed the room and put her hands on both sides of his face and kissed him with a thoroughness that left him considerably short of operational. Afterward, leaning against the wall with her forehead down near his, she said, "I am going to keep being this frightened, Charles. I want to be honest with you." "What are you frightened of?" "Wanting this much," she said. "It is enormous. Wanting this much is very large." "I know," he said. "I know it is." He put his arms around as much of her as he could reach, which was the middle of her, and held on. "I'm not going anywhere." She made a sound against the top of his head that he felt more than heard, not quite a word, somewhere between a sigh and the orc syllable for home, which he did not yet know was a word but would learn was one later. The case against Fass came to trial at the Garrison Hall 6 weeks after his arrest. It was methodical and ultimately conclusive. The Manifest Code Registry, the discrepancy notice, the night watchman's testimony, and the testimony of 2 of Fass's associates who had decided cooperation with the garrison was more comfortable than solidarity with their arrested employer. All of it came together in front of Commander's Justice Pierre Ashad with the weight of something that had been building a long time. Fass was convicted of smuggling contraband war steel and of the murder of Tam Briscoe. He was sentenced to 15 years in the garrison prison, his assets forfeited to the Port Authority. Ghorza was in the gallery for the verdict, sitting in the wide seat they had dragged in from the corridor because the regular benches were not adequate. Charles was beside her. When Shad read the verdict, Ghorza's hand found his under the bench and held it, and stayed holding it until they were outside. She stood on the Garrison Hall steps in the wind off the harbor and looked out at the town that had called her murderer 6 weeks ago, and she breathed slowly, in and out. "Are you all right?" he said. The second time he had asked her that. "Yes," she said, and this time she meant it without qualification. He would have let it rest there, it should have rested there. The case was closed, the contract was safe. Briscoe was as close to avenged as the law could make him, and life should have settled into the good thing it was becoming. But there was one piece of it that had not resolved, and it resolved itself 13 days later in a way nobody had predicted, and that Charles would remember for the rest of his life. Fass had a brother, Daron Fass, 7 years younger than Gregor, and when Charles would later look back on the whole thing, he would think that someone should have kept better track of Daron Fass, who had apparently taken his brother's conviction as a personal injury rather than a legal outcome, and had spent 13 days working himself up to doing something about it. He chose a Thursday, which was market day in Saltmere, when the harbor road was crowded and loud and full of carts and traders and people with things to sell and nowhere private to retreat to. He walked up to Ghorza in the open square in front of the cooperage with 20 people watching, and he said loudly that the orc had gotten away with killing his brother by lying to a garrison woman who would believe an orc over a decent man, and that someone needed to correct this. And then he drew a knife. The crowd went very quiet. He was not a small man, Daron Fass, not as tall as his brother had been, but broad-shouldered and red-faced and clearly several ales into a bad decision. The knife was a working blade, heavy, well used. He was standing in the open square holding it, and there were 20 people watching, and none of them were moving. Ghorza looked at the knife. She looked at Daron Fass. Her expression did not change. "Put it away," she said. "You ruined my family," he said. Your brother ran contraband steel and killed a customs recorder and blamed me for it," she said in the same quiet, level voice. "Your brother ruined your family. Put the knife away." She is right. That was Charles coming around the corner of the cooperage with a load of timber in his arms that he had been transporting from the dockyard. He set it down on the ground deliberately in the middle of the square. He stepped in front of Ghorza. Daron Fass stared at him. "Get out of the way, Bailey." "No," Charles said, "this is not your fight." "You are pointing a knife at someone who matters to me," Charles said. "In what possible version of this is it not my fight?" He was not armed. He had left his mallet at the yard. He had a marking pen behind his ear and a timber-hauling rope over his shoulder, and he was standing in the square in front of 60 combined pounds of muscle and a working knife, and there were 20 people watching, and he did not move. Ghorza behind him put her hand on his shoulder and moved him gently but definitively to the side. "Stand back," she said. "Ghorza, stand back, Charles." Her voice was calm and warm and absolute. She stepped past him into the square. She looked at Daron Fass with those amber-green eyes, and she said, "If you want to make this a duel, I will accept. If you want to walk away, I will let you. Those are your only options, because I am not going to stand in this square and be threatened by a man whose brother I did not kill." Fass's face was dark red. He had the face of a man who had gotten himself into a place he had not entirely thought through and did not know how to back out of with the crowd watching. He raised the knife. "Then duel," he said. Charles's heart dropped through the dock planks at his feet. He made a move forward, and Ghorza's hand was on his arm, not restraining him, just present, just real. "Watch," she said. Very quietly, just for him. She pulled her own belt knife. A long, broad blade she wore at her left hip and settled into a stance that came from somewhere deep in the body, the kind of stance that is not learned in a fortnight but built over years of knowing exactly where your weight is and what you can do with it. And then she waited. Daron Fass attacked. He was fast, actually, faster than Charles had expected, and he clearly knew how to use the knife, which meant this was not going to be one-sided in the laughable way it might look like from outside. He went in low and hard, and Ghorza moved to meet him, not back, never back, and the crowd surged away from the center of the square as the two of them engaged. The clash of blades was sharp and immediate, a sound that cut through the market noise and brought everyone who had been in the surrounding streets to the square's edge. She was something to watch. Charles had known she was strong, had known it the way you know an architectural fact, but watching Ghorza fight was something beyond that, something that combined the strength with a precision that was almost technical, a management of her own size and reach and leverage that was extraordinary. She was not reckless with it. She was not brutal. She was controlled in a way that was, paradoxically, more frightening than brutality would have been, because it communicated a complete and accurate understanding of what she could do and a deliberate choice about what she was choosing to do. Fass's first rush she turned with a check block that cost him his momentum and put him off balance on the left. His second approach she sidestepped and let him carry past her, and as he turned she put her blade flat against his knife wrist with a precision that was nearly surgical, and he dropped the knife from the shock of it. He scrambled for it with his other hand, and she put her boot on it. She looked down at him. He was on his knees in the square with his wrist held in a grip that was not cruel but was absolute, his knife under her boot, the crowd ringing them 3 people deep in every direction. "The duel is over," she said. "Say it." His face was still red. He was breathing hard and his pride was doing terrible things to his judgment. "Say it," she said again, patient as stone. He looked up at her. Something in his expression cracked, not the way she cracked warmly but the way bad things crack, with a sound that means something is done. "It is over," he said, low, rough, defeated. She released his wrist. She stepped back off the knife. She sheathed her own blade. "Go home, Daron Fass," she said. "Grieve your brother properly. He made his choices. You do not have to make the same ones." He looked at the ground. He stood up. He did not look at the crowd. He walked away and the crowd let him through and the square was very quiet for a long moment. Then Merritt, who had come out of the anchor house 20 yards away to watch, started to clap. It was a single slow clap at first, the kind that says, "I have seen something worth remembering." And then a few others joined it, and a few more, and it became something real, not universal. Not everyone in the square, because this was Saltmere and Saltmere was complicated about its opinions but substantial. Sustained. Enough. Charles walked into the center of the square. He walked up to her. She was watching the retreating back of Daron Fass and her breathing was returning to normal, one long controlled exhale at a time. He took her hand. She looked down at him with an expression that was very tired and very fierce and very relieved, all 3 at once, and he held her hand in both of his, and she let him, and they stood in the middle of the square in the thin winter sun with the market noise beginning again around them slowly, the world reassembling itself. "You did not have to stand in front of that knife," she said. "I know," he said. "Charles." "You did not have to tell me to watch," he said. "But you did. Because you knew I needed to see you handle it yourself." A pause. "Yes," she said. "I know what you are," he said. "I know what you can do. I'm not standing in front of you because I think you need protecting. I'm standing with you because that is where I want to be. There is a difference." She looked at him for a long time. The copper rings caught the winter light. The market around them was alive again, carts and voices and the smell of smoked fish and sea salt. "There is a difference," she said. "Yes." She squeezed his hand once carefully, with the same precise control she used for everything, and then she looked around at the market, at the people who had watched, at the faces that had shifted, at the town that had spent weeks deciding what it thought of her. And she stood to her full height, and she lifted her chin, and she met every gaze that came her way steadily, without apology. That evening they stayed in long after Merritt had shut the common room. The fire had burned to coals and the last ale was gone, and they were on the wide bench by the window with the harbor dark outside and her arm around him. Not the other way, because he fit under her arm better than the other way, and they had both stopped caring about which way was conventional. And his head was against her shoulder, and she was running the copper ring from her braid through her free fingers in an absent rhythmic motion that he had learned, was what she did when she was thinking. "I have been offered something," she said. "Tell me." "The Harbor Merchant Cooperative wants to give me the senior freight contract," she said. Oz suggested it. "They need someone who can manage the full pier load since Fass's operation was shut down. There is a gap in the tonnage management. It is a significant contract. It would mean staying in Saltmere indefinitely." "What is the consideration?" he said. "The consideration is that it requires a permanent address and a bond," she said. "Not a rented room. a leased property with a legal address which would serve as security against the contract value. He was quiet for a moment. "The old Guildhouse property on the end of Cordage Street," he said, "near the rope walk. It has been vacant for 2 years. The landlord would lease it." "It is too large for one person," she said. "Yes," he said. She was quiet. The copper ring moved through her fingers. The harbor wind found the window seam and moved the candle. "I am not asking," she said carefully. "I want to be clear. I am not asking you to make a decision about your life because of a lease." "I know you are not asking," he said. "I am telling. Charles." "I have a rented room with one shutter and a mattress from the previous century," he said. "I have been in Saltmere for 4 years, and I have built ships that will last 30, and I do not own one board of a place to live. He paused. "I have wanted a place to be for a long time. I have just not had enough reason to fight for one." She tilted her head down so her chin was resting on his hair. "And now I have a reason," he said. "Too, if you count the cog frame I still need to finish." "I am ranked below a cog frame," she said, very dry. "You are ranked significantly above a cog frame," he said, "but the cog frame is already started and requires completion." "The logic is sound," she said. He turned and looked up at her. The firelight was low and warm on her face, on the green-gray of her skin and the copper in her rings and the soft amber of her eyes, and she was looking at him with an expression that was fully open, all the way open, the way he had first seen it on the dock in the dark, no walls anywhere. "I want to live with you," he said. It was a plain statement, not dressed up, not hedged. "Not because of a lease and not because of a contract. Because you are Ghorza, you are the most extraordinary person I have ever sat down beside. And I have sat down beside you every chance I've had since the first day. I'm going to keep doing that." Her hand, the one that had been running the copper ring through her fingers, came to rest on the side of his face, the same place it had been on the dock. She held him there with that careful, precise warmth and looked at him for a long time. "In my clan," she said, "there is a custom. When 2 people decide to build something together, a household, a life, one of them gives the other a mark, not a wound, a voluntary mark worn in the skin that says, 'I chose this, I choose you.' It is," she paused, "it is considered a serious thing. It is not done lightly." "Show me," he said. She turned his left wrist over in her hand and pressed the pad of her thumb to the inside of it, not hard, just touching. "Here," she said, "traditionally, where the pulse is." He could feel his pulse under her thumb. He thought it was probably communicating more information than was dignified. "What does it look like?" he said. "It is a mark of the hand," she said. "Pressed in pigment and fixed with." She stopped. "It is a simple thing, a small spiral no larger than a thumb's width. It means this person and I have chosen each other. Do both people get one?" "If both people want it," she said. "Both or neither." He looked at his wrist where her thumb was resting. Then he looked up at her. "Both," he said. The expression that moved across her face was enormous and quiet and briefly, completely uncontrolled, and then it settled into something warm and certain and his. "It requires the pigment and the tools," she said. "I have them in my pack. I brought them from the border country because—" She stopped. "Because you brought hope with you," he said. "Do not say things like that," she said, in a voice that said entirely the opposite. "I will say things like that whenever they are accurate," he said. She pulled him up off the bench. They went upstairs. She had the tools in a small pouch, a bone stylus, and a vial of dark blue-green pigment mixed with something that smelled of pine resin. She sat him on the edge of the bed and she pulled the lamp close and she marked him with the care and precision she brought to everything, her brow slightly furrowed, her tongue just visible at the corner of her mouth in concentration. The stylus was not painful, a warmth, a slight sting, nothing a shipwright's hands would notice. He watched her face while she worked rather than his wrist. When it was done, she showed him his own wrist, a small spiral, clean-lined and exact, the dark pigment settling into his skin. "Now mine," she said, and held out her wrist. He took the stylus and the pigment and he worked as carefully as he could, which was careful because he had a shipwright's understanding of precision and a draftsman's eye for line. It took longer than her work on him had her skin tone made the placement require more care, but when he lifted the stylus it was right. The same spiral, clean and matched. She looked at it for a long time. "Ghorza Mudborn," he said quietly. She looked up. "I choose you," he said. "In whatever version of this world you want to build, I choose you in it." She set down her wrist, and she put both her hands on his face, and she kissed him the way she had on the dock, careful and present and warm. And then the lamp guttered in the draft from the window and neither of them moved to relight it. And the harbor was dark outside and the town was quiet. And inside the room above the anchor house on Cordage Street in the port of Saltmere, two people who had been watching themselves alone for a long time chose something different. The old guild house property on the end of Cordage Street had been a mercantile hall in its better years, and before that something grander, though what exactly nobody could now say. There were carved figures on the doorposts that did not match any current guild symbol, and a cellar room with a vaulted ceiling that might have been a counting house or a chapel, depending on your imagination. It had 6 rooms, ceilings high enough for Ghorza to stand without ducking in 5 of them, and a yard large enough to stage a freight wagon, which was immediately relevant. The landlord, a widower named Sable who had been trying to lease it for 2 years without success because the rent was too high for a single household, was willing to negotiate when presented with a lease proposal backed by the senior freight contract of the Harbor Merchant Cooperative. Charles handled the negotiation. He had never negotiated a lease before in his life, but he had spent 4 years watching dock contracts get drawn and redrawn, and he had his father's instinct for what a thing was worth versus what someone thought it was worth. He brought Ghorza to the second meeting, not as a prop, but because Sable kept trying to add clauses and Charles found that Ghorza's presence at the table, silent and attentive, caused Sable to re-examine the wisdom of unnecessary additions in a way that was productive for everyone. They signed a 5-year lease at a rate that was fair. Moving in took one morning, because neither of them had accumulated much that was worth carrying. Ghorza's freight equipment, her harness and sling hooks and weight scales went in the yard. Her books, of which there were 14, went on the shelf in the main room. Charles's tools went in the workshop they cleared in the back room, and his marking pen collection. He had, it turned out, 11, which she found both specific and characteristic went in a cup on the workbench. The box he had made her for the copper rings went on the windowsill. Merritt from the anchor house came by with a covered dish, and what appeared to be the entire common room's worth of opinion about how they had done the right thing, delivered in the form of a 15-minute speech over the threshold that was somehow both unsolicited and entirely welcome. Jarn Oss sent a formal note of congratulations on the cooperative contract, with a basket of imported salt crackers that Charles suspected was Oss's dry way of making a point. Dunner Pell came by with a jug of something that was technically wine. In the evening, when everyone had come and gone, they stood in the main room of the old guild house in the last of the day's light, with the harbor smell coming through the open window and the carved doorpost figures casting long shadows on the floor, and Ghorza turned in a slow circle in the center of the room, arms at her sides, head back looking up at the ceiling, which was high enough by nearly half a foot. "It fits," she said. "It fits," he agreed. She stopped turning and looked at him. She was backlit by the window, the copper rings catching the last light, the dark braid over her shoulder, the laced blouse and the cinched leather belt he knew by now as well as his own hands. She was enormous and she was entirely, deeply, visibly happy, and it was the most straightforward, beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Charles Bailey," she said. "Ghorza Mudborn," he said. She crossed the room in 3 strides and lifted him, just lifted him with her hands under his arms as easily as a freight sling handles a grain bale, until they were at eye level, face to face, and she looked at him with those amber-green shallow water eyes from 6 inches away. "I'm going to need you to stop being so exactly the right person," she said. "That seems unlikely," he said. "I know," she said. "I know it is." She tilted her head and pressed her nose to his. "Good." He kissed her. She held him in the air without effort and kissed him back, and outside the window the harbor ran dark and silver, and the evening bells of Saltmere began to ring. 1, 2, 3, 4, marking the turn of the day. And inside the old guild house at the end of Cordage Street, the lamp was not yet lit, and there was no particular rush to light it. In the weeks after they moved in, Saltmere made its adjustments. This was not a peaceful or particularly gracious process. Downs are not gracious about the things they have to adjust to. And Saltmere was a harbor town with a long memory and a fair amount of pride about both. There were people who came by the guild house out of curiosity, because the Humanork lease was interesting gossip, and some of them were neighbors who found, on meeting Ghorza face to face, and at eye level rather than in a panicked crowd situation, that she was considerably more actual and considerably less terrifying than the version they had assembled in their heads. Some of them were not neighbors and were not kind, and for those Charles developed a reliable and economical approach. He opened the door, he said good morning or good evening as applicable. He made it clear that the conversation was concluded, and he closed the door again. Ghorza watched this from the hall the first 2 times it happened, and on the 3rd time she came to the door herself and stood at his shoulder, which reached roughly her sternum and added nothing, only stood there, and the man on the step reconsidered his entire day and left. "Good technique," Charles said, closing the door. "I have had practice," she said. "We should combine them," he said. "You door, I close." She looked at him. "That is possibly the most efficient thing you have said this week." "I am a shipwright. Efficiency is a core value." She put her arm over his shoulders. She had taken to doing this, a comfortable, warm, casually enormous gesture that he had adapted to with no particular difficulty, and they went back into the house. The freight contract proved to be even more demanding than expected, because Fass's operation had left more disarray in the pier management than anyone had initially realized, and Ghorza spent several weeks untangling 3 years of quietly incorrect tonnage records. She brought the work home in the evenings, and Charles helped when she wanted a second set of eyes, and in return she reviewed his timber estimates for the new commission he had taken on a river barge for a merchant upriver, his first commission independent of the dockyard, which was a significant thing. They were both building something. They both knew they were building it together. There were evenings when the paperwork was done, and the fire was burning, and she would sit on the wide bench with her feet up, and he would lean against her, just lean, the way you lean against something solid and reliable, and warm, and she would be reading one of her books and sometimes reading aloud, translating the passages that were in the border country orc script into the trade tongue for him. And he would listen and sometimes disagree with her translation choices on grounds that were, she said, linguistically unfounded, and they would argue about it with the focused pleasure of 2 people who discover that they are well matched in the specific way that matters most. He learned 3 words of orc in this period. She learned to describe the stress points in a hull frame. Both of them considered this an equitable exchange. The final business, the hard bargain, came at the end of the 2nd month in the guild house, when the garrison magistrate closed the Fass case officially and released the forfeited assets to the port authority for redistribution. Among those assets was the Customs House Cargo Code Registry, which the port authority needed to rebuild properly to function. Commander's Justice Pirashad called a formal assembly of harbor stakeholders to settle the question of the registry's administration, which was, in practical terms, the question of who ran the customs function going forward. Jarn Os proposed Ghorza for the records oversight position. He made the proposal in the assembly in front of 40 harbor merchants and the port authority representative and Constable Aldrich, who had been considerably quieter since the Fass verdict and showed no sign of objecting loudly to anything today. The proposal was that Ghorza, whose work on untangling Fass's peer records had already demonstrated both her mathematical competence and her integrity, should serve as freight records overseer for the harbor cooperative, with oversight authority over the customs manifest process. There was objection. Of course there was objection. This was Saltmere, and the objectors were not entirely wrong that it was a significant position for someone who had, 6 weeks ago, been accused of murder, even though the accusation had been refuted. They made their points. Some of the points were about competence, which were addressable. Some of the points were about blood, which were not, and those Ghorza addressed herself, standing in the assembly hall with 40 faces turned up at her and saying, in a voice that was level and clear and entirely without apology, "I have managed freight accounts accurately for 5 years in 3 different ports. I am literate in the trade tongue and the border country script, which makes me useful for cross-border manifests that currently go untranslated and therefore get misfiled. I know where the gaps in the current system are because I spent 6 weeks finding them. You can employ me and benefit from that, or you can employ someone less qualified and explain the decision to your margins. I am not asking you to trust my blood. I am asking you to trust the work." Then she sat down. Charles was in the second row of the gallery because he was not a stakeholder of the cooperative and had no standing to speak. But he was there and she had known he was there, and when she sat down she did not look for him. She was too seasoned a professional to play to the gallery, but her hand dropped briefly to the inside of her wrist, where the spiral mark was, and pressed once. He pressed his own wrist with his thumb. The assembly voted. The result was not unanimous. It was 17-11 in favor, with 12 abstentions, which was not a triumph but was enough. The position was Ghorza's. Afterward in the street Os shook their hands and said something gracious and left quickly because there was a manifest revision he needed to file by sundown. Dunner Pell, who had come to watch out of solidarity and had no particular stake in the outcome, told Charles he had done well. Charles said he had not done anything, and Pell said that was exactly what he meant. They walked home along Cordage Street. The sun was dropping toward the harbor, and the light was amber-orange on the stone of the old buildings and warm on her gray-green skin, and he was keeping pace beside her with 2 long strides to every one of hers, which he had gotten very good at, and she was looking ahead at the guild house with its carved doorposts, and her free hand was swinging at her side. 17-11, he said. It will be 20-8 next time, she said. Give it 6 months. He believed her completely. Congratulations, he said. Thank you, she paused. Thank you for being in the second row. Where else would I be, he said. She looked over and down at him with that fully open expression, all the amber-green warmth of her, and she put her arm over his shoulders as they reached the door. Inside, she said, there is a bottle of the good wine that Pell brought and I have been saving it. Is this the occasion, he said. This is the occasion, she said. We have a 5-year lease, a senior contract, and a position of oversight authority, and I am going to sit down in my own house and drink the good wine with the person I chose. The person you chose, he said. He liked the sound of it. The person I chose, she repeated, firm and warm and sure. She reached past him and opened the door. They went inside. He lit the lamp while she found the bottle. The carved doorpost figures sent their long shadows across the floor, and the harbor moved outside the window, and the evening bells began to ring again. 1, 2, 3, 4. And in the lamp glow of the old guild house on Cordage Street, Ghorza Mudborn poured 2 cups of wine and handed one to Charles Bailey, and they drank to the bargain they had won together. Not just the contract, not just the lease, not just the position, all of it. The life they were building, plank by plank, the way you build a ship from the keel up, made to last. She was enormous, and she was sitting in her own home, and the tears on her face this time, if there were any, were of a different kind, entirely the kind that come not from grief or fear, but from the astonishing, disorienting fact of being, at last, in the exact right place with the exact right person, having been uncertain for a long time that such a place existed. He put his hand on her knee, which was the highest he could comfortably reach from the bench beside her, and she put her hand over his, the spiral marks facing up on both their wrists, pressed together. "Ghorza," he said. "Charles," she said. The lamp burned. The harbor moved. The town outside went on being the complicated, difficult, slowly adjusting thing it was. And inside the old guild house the two of them went on being what they had chosen to become, a made thing, built with care and precision from the salvage of two people who had been too long alone, joined now at the keel in the deepest part of the structure, where the strength lives. It would hold. They had both checked the joints.